for a few, just generally conspiracy pilled podcasters, but not something that like had as many like long documentary videos about it the same way Tartaria or Flat Earth or any number of more, I don't say mainstream conspiracies. But then it hit me, the Mandela effect itself is not really a conspiracy theory. It's like a phenomenon. There are conspiracy theories that spiral out from the Mandela effect, but it's not, at its core a conspiracy. It's what you do with it that makes it that can lead to being conspiratorial. And of course, I think I've problematized the phrase conspiracy theory enough. When what I actually mean usually is fringe theory, and then that can be part of a community, right? Like a fringe theory community group, or a community can be formed around belief in a conspiracy theory. Like flat earthers are a group, a community that have formed around their collective belief in the earth being flat. Uh, and while the obviously politically loaded ways in which conspiracy theory is mobilized by our like centrist media, by our corporate media to delegitimize any idea outside of the mainstream. We all know those things, so I'm just expecting you to be forgiving when I use the word conspiracy theory the way that most people use it, because I just think as a colloquialism, we all know what it means. Even if on the left we know to problematize its usage by like more establishment aligned figures to, like I said, delegitimize um, fringe or non-sanctioned ideas. But obviously, a lot of things are swept into that bucket. Mm. Mm-mm. But yeah, yeah. So I'm excited for this because I don't know much about what's going on with the Mandela effect in the modern day. Like, what is it? That like that guy from the How to with John Wilson video was the first time I even knew there was a Mandela effect conference. Like, because I tend to think of the Mandela effect as an individual phenomenon. And you know what? Let's engage with the chat a little bit, and then we'll just hop right into the episode. We'll just hop into the whole thing. Fenton Fenton Mully on YouTube says, when I investigate into these conspiracy theories and the people who believe them, I continue to see that the basis of them all is a confusion about consciousness. Uh, I don't exactly know what you mean by that, but I can interpret that in my own head in such a way that I agree with. So I'm going to give you like a light agree there. Um, what up, the strategist 23? Hey, docile terrorist. Um, Ibrahim Mohammed, I am my own conspiracy. That's exactly right. That's what it means to have self esteem. Don't forget just some dumb guys. Oh yeah, that's a big part of it. Metagetta, lol, what? I joined just in time to hear NASA's Hebrew for deceive. It's not. That's a line from the Netflix Flat Earther documentary that has always stuck with me. Like as a good encapsulation of the kinds of like random dismissive things that are untrue that like conspiracy addled people will like say and just like be like, oh yeah, like a throwaway line, like, and then expect you to fully understand and agree with that. I just, I have my own problems. Sorry to hear you have to move, Bob Carmody. That can be very stressful. I appreciate the all-seeing eye emoji, Sauvignon citizen. Metagetta, Alex Jones popularized 9/11 conspiracy theories. I mean, 9/11 conspiracy theories, which we will be getting into, that was another option that we could have done today, but I want to save that for like 9/11 as a shameless attempt for clout. Uh, but those can be very interesting too. And they range, right? Because 9/11 is one of those things like JFK's assassination, where there are clearly some things that are untoward going on, even if you only consider just like the Bush administration having foreknowledge of like an idea of an attack. and then the ways in which 9/11 spiraled out into the Iraq War, right, which had nothing to do in reality with 9/11, but became part of that narrative, right? So there are conspiratorial elements surrounding 9/11, and this is why I was making that sort of disclaimer earlier about like being careful generally with how we use the word conspiracy, because it's oftentimes used by more establishment aligned politicians, political media, critical media, like public figures, to delegitimize non-sanctioned, right, status quo sanctioned messaging around events, which can oftentimes be closer to the truth than what they're pushing, because the you know the true the true dichotomy is not like the truth in conspiracy theories, right? It's something a little bit more nuanced than that. And especially when you think of like oftentimes what the truth is in our current political media environment is just like whatever legacy media wants to print at the time. And then they also have the luxury of retracting or semi retracting or just never mentioning the stories that they printed that were based largely on falsehoods, that were poorly sourced, that weren't well researched, that gave rise to conspiracy theories or were conspiratorial, like a la, the Havana syndrome. It's just taken for granted that if they're printing it, there's some kind of legitimacy to it. And so we know that like mainstream sources traffic in things that we would consider to be conspiracy theory if we were making that judgment based not on alignment or prestige with the alignment with the status quo or prestige in our particular like economy or within our culture, and just like the actual scientific veracity of the ideas being shown. A lot of conspiracies, a lot of conspiracies, a lot of conspiracies are well believed by our society because they form the basis for Western chauvinism or American supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. Historical conspiracies, and I'm using the phrase conspiracy in this way to mean alternative narratives about events that occurred to portray a very specific political agenda, um, or to like forward a very specific political agenda. Of course, say propaganda in this case, but that's neither here nor there. Obviously, we're going to just have to accept that for today and for episodes like this, we're going to just be using the word conspiracy the way they want us to use it, as opposed to in a more nuanced way, just because it's hard to find the right language for what we're discussing without kind of falling back on the word conspiracy, because it just is so evocative because of the way it's used with what I mean. Uh, but yeah, let's with the I say all that to say this. We're going to be falling down the rabbit hole together. I don't know where we are with the Mandela conspiracy nowadays. These are some videos that I was able to find on YouTube because by nature of it really not being a conspiracy, the Mandela effect at its core, YouTube doesn't really block crazy videos about it. Usually if you're looking for like anti-vaxxer stuff, if you're looking for like flat earth stuff, if you're looking for, um, I don't even know what another good conspiracy in that vein is, like New World Order stuff or Tartarian stuff. YouTube just like buries it. You kind of have to really, really know where to find it, and you'll find more of that stuff like on Rumble. But because of this is just more of a curiosity at its core. YouTube still allows these videos to be readily findable, and by nature of that, some of the more conspiratorial versions of these, rather versions of these videos, are also easily findable on YouTube. So today's a YouTube centric day, which is great. I'm very excited. So I guess we should start. And I realized that I made this mistake when I was searching for videos, because I just got so entranced by what I was finding already that I did not like grab a more, I don't know what you'd call it, just more like scientific video that explains what the Mandela effect actually is, just like a more like bog standard like explainer video that's a little bit more just like mainstream. But I think I could do a probably a better job of explaining what the Mandela effect is and what causes it, right, than the average video I'd be able to find on YouTube. So For those of you who are not aware, the Mandela effect is a phrase, term that refers to the phenomenon of individuals and groups of people misremembering events and details about their own lives, about the past, about society, about culture, about history, the world, right? Misremembering details about the world. And then having a type of cognitive dissonance, intellectual schism, inability to contend with or accept the fact that they have misremembered details from the past and adopt some alternative rationale for why things are not the way they remember them to be. And I say an alternative rationality because there is a host of reasons, a host of explanations besides the ones I'm going to give you for why and how the Mandela effect works, or what causes it. Um, I have my opinion about what causes it, right? So, at its core, and I think this is the sort of the basic reason, is that the majority of Americans are what I always say. What do I say, class? High ego, low intelligence. And by low intelligence, I mean low information. I mean low ability to rationally engage with unidentified, let's say, phenomenon that they come across in the wild, right? And by unidentified, I mean unidentified to them. So, like, if the average person sees like a bug they don't recognize, they don't know how to find out what that bug is. They don't have those like critical thinking skills. Um, and yeah, like things that spiral out from that. And so that causes a host of problems in our society. A lot of them have to do with people being very susceptible to believing um, like random fringe ideas, whether they be about the Mandela effect, whether they be about I would say 9/11, about 9/11. It makes them susceptible to all sorts. It makes them susceptible to being indoctrinated by cults. It makes them susceptible to being um, indoctrinated by the far right, any number of fringe groups like conspiracy theories, flat earthers. It just makes people very easy to get into those kinds of negative communities because of the ways in which conspiracy groups, fringe groups, far right ideologies coddle the ego of their initiates, right? And since this is a very ego driven, like society, narratives that coddle the ego will always be more attractive to people than narratives that challenge the ego. And so you find people falling and susceptible to these things by nature of that. They don't know what's going on around them, and but they do know that they're the great that they're the greatest. And there are a lot of people out there who have made a great living off of scamming one way or another people like that. But that's just like the core reason that what makes people in our society susceptible to a lot of different like dysfunctional things, like dysfunctional thought patterns, faulty logical frameworks, everything. Um, when it comes to the Mandela effect specifically, I would say, and don't quote me on this because I might come up with another reason as I'm listing these. There are probably like four things that I can say or I can think of that contribute to like the Mandela effect. Some of them are like personal and psychological, and some of them are just like environmental. The first is that human beings have notoriously bad memories. People don't like to think of themselves as having a bad memory, although some people will admit it. But like the human memory is faulty in a lot of ways that neuroscientists, which I am not, can explain to you. A lot of time people confabulate. A lot of time people develop memories that do not exist by nature of them, like being, um, subjected to trauma. A lot of times people will not admit when they are recalling stories that they were in some way inebriated. And I don't even just mean, or like had altered consciousness in one way. Drinking can impact your memory. Long-term drug use or current drug use can impact your memory. Being tired can impact your memory. A lot of things that just might be going on in the world around you can impact your memory, and people don't oftentimes think of it. There's a reason why the majority of the majority of false imprisonments, like people who are sent up on like false charges, are done so as the result of like eyewitness testimony being the core piece of evidence. And it's not always just because someone is trying to set someone up or someone is trying to like lie about something for like racially motivated reasons or personally motivated reasons. Sometimes it's literally people's memories just being like just dog shit. Uh, Another thing is sort of semi-related to memories, like number two, people, especially Americans, and I do feel like based on my research so far, this is largely an American, like this, people who believe in the Mandela effect largely over-index for being Americans. That might just be me being rude. I did see one video from a French person, but like it seems like a largely American phenomenon. Uh, Not very observant. So like a lot of people think they pay really good attention, but they actually don't to the world around them. That should be, again, we do news every day. You should be able to come up with your own examples of that. But yeah, people do not pay very good attention. They're very easy to whip up into a frenzy over something that has always existed around them that they had never given any thought to until someone points it out to them for the first time. And they're like, whoa, can you believe it? Another good example of that was the drone situation, right? That was going on in New Jersey and along the East Coast when, at the height of the winter, in the fog hazed shores of the East Coast of New England, people were insisting that they were seeing strange lights in the sky that they had never seen before, ever, ever, ever. And local politicians were feeding into it. Local police officers were feeding into it. Uh, Donald Trump was feeding into it, only for him to get elected and for them to ask about it again, and for him to just go, oh no, those were just planes and normal commercial or research drones. You just don't know what anything is or looks like. You just like you just don't know how to identify a helicopter or a plane through the fog of winter with just your eyes. It's you just don't know what you're looking at. Happens all the time. A lot of different categories of things that happens in. Goes without saying. Obviously, this goes back to my first point about people being high ego, low intelligence. A lot of people don't like to accept those things because of that. They don't like to accept the fact that their memory is probably not very good, not because they're old, not because they're, inebriated, but just because they're human. Like everyone just wants to imagine that they have a perfect memory. Same with not necessarily paying very good attention or being hyper competent. Everyone likes to imagine that that's something about them that they, have like an innate quality. Just isn't the case. You should be able to admit that you're wrong. That's another issue here. People not being able to admit when they're wrong. And so, besides those like broadly social and like psychological reasons, there are like I would say two probably environmental reasons why this also happens. Um, the first is that a lot of people don't actually watch or consume the things that they think that they do directly. They consume them as mediated through other cultural products. And so let me give you an example of that. A lot of people will tell you that they have seen Star Wars, like Star Wars: A New Hope, Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, and Star Wars: Return of the Jedi, hundreds of times. They'll tell you, I've seen it 100 times. I can repeat that. I can repeat every word from that movie by memory. I've seen it 100 times. Though a lot of those people are lying, and what they really mean is that they've caught segments of the movie on television a bunch of times. That there are a lot of us like that. A lot of us, and this is true, a lot of people have seen a movie 100 times but have never seen the non-TV edited version of it. So they're surprised when the words are different in the movie. Like if you've seen The Mummy, like how many times have you seen The Mummy with Brendan Fraser? And how many times have you seen the theatrical cut of The Mummy by Brendan Fraser, the one that's not edited for TNT on Sunday afternoons? Like that's something like that, right? Um, for Star Wars, a lot of people, by nature of how widely parodied and adapted something like Star Wars is, they imagine that they've seen Star Wars when what they're remembering is like, oh no, I've seen Spaceballs, and then I've seen the Robot Chicken Star Wars parody that came on like a few times per year. I've seen the Family Guy version of Star Wars, and maybe I've seen Star Wars itself like one or two times, and it was 20, 30 years ago. And then every other instance of that is me remembering someone quoting Star Wars on The Big Bang Theory and going like, "Oh yeah, Star Wars, I know that." Like a lot that happens to a lot of people, and then when they actually sit down to watch it, like actually watch it again for the first time, and this happens with people who have kids, like they will have imagined that they've seen Star Wars 100 times. Then their kid is 11. They go, "I've never seen A New Hope, Daddy." They sit them down to actually watch it for the first time. This goes back to paying attention. A lot of people half watch things. They watch the movie and they watch their phone, which means they're not really paying attention, which means their memory is altered by nature of that, or faulty by nature of that. So you'll have someone who watches Star Wars: A New Hope as an adult for the first time, despite convincing themselves that they've seen it 100 times with their kid, only to be surprised by how different it is than what they recall, which is a half memory from watching it on television a few times when they were a kid, and then all of the like parodies they've seen. Um, so that's one environmental effect. The last one is one that it's harder to really quantify or prove, but I imagine has happened and given people a very false sense of memory. And I only mention it because it's now probably going to happen a lot more given AI's ability to craft incredibly compelling photographic artifacts of things that have never existed. I don't know if you guys have seen or heard of like the fake AI bakeries on Instagram where it pretends, or like, and by it I don't mean the like the AI itself. I mean there is someone out there who runs an account that pretends to be like a bakery in Dallas, Texas, that has like that just runs the Instagram as though it is a real bakery, and it produces images that are like created through AI that I guess if you're not very familiar with what AI images look like, or if you're only half scrolling through your like Instagram feed, you could think is real, a real bakery that really exists in your town or a town over there. And so people will have vivid memories of that at some point. And so yeah, we're basically all fucked as a society. But what I'm going to say is a related thing, which is that especially when it comes to living in like the 90s and 80s and early 2000s, this is less common now. A lot of people are just remembering bootlegs, in my opinion. A lot of people, like for example, the cornucopia in the fruit of the loom tag. Like there might have been a cornucopia on a tag in a shirt that had fruit in it like that, but it might have been a shirt that was like a knockoff of Fruit of the Loom. You might have had like a knockoff of it. You might have had a knockoff version of something. It's just the reality of it. And that's why you're also misremembering, because you're remembering your knockoff version, which you didn't know was fake because you were young, and now you're trying to contrast it with like the real version. So for me, those are like the four major reasons that it happens, all underpinned by like the low intelligence, high ego reality of being an American, which makes people reluctant to admit fault or wrongness as though it's taboo, and also have a difficult time with like, hey, this thing that I'm seeing doesn't comport to my reality, or I don't know how to place it. Let me investigate in a way that is, you know, objective and critical, and not just meant to reinforce my biases. That's like the low intelligence part again. Um, so I'm going to pause there, and then I'm going to read some of the chat to make sure that I'm not doing something terribly wrong already. Um, Stride9 on uh, Twitch says, I watched Hackers for the first time since wow. I watched Hackers for the first time since VHS on Sunday, and it was almost new to me. I forgot so much of it. Did you remember the part where is this in Hackers where like the villain gets driven into the alley for the meetup with the main kid, whose name, oh my god, I can't remember what his name is, but he is the main guy from the from Mindhunters. You might not be able to see what I'm pointing to, but this is like a Japanese promotional insert for the movie Mindhunters, directed by Rennie Harlin, and it's the same guy who is the main character in Hackers as Mindhunters, and like he meets up with the main villain in like an alleyway, like a smoke-filled, mist-filled alleyway. And because it's the 90s and they thought this was cool, like the villain comes in like riding on a skateboard being pulled by like a limo. Like he's not in the limo. He's hired the limo to pull him behind it on like while he like hangs out on a skateboard. It probably really slapped in the 90s. Watching it recently, it was just like stupid, but yeah. Uh, Fenton Mully on YouTube says, it's just how memory storage works in our brains. The problem is that the majority of the population can't understand that. Yeah. This is like, so the Mandela effect is also in that sense semi-related to deja vu. At least the last time I looked into deja vu, and one of the explanations for it was also because of people's like faulty, constantly rewriting memories. Uh, Howard Nutleg on Twitch says, "A New Hope feels so much slower when you watch it as an adult. Not worse by any means, just slower." Squatch TV 247 on Twitch says, "Because certain things are easier to misremember than others, this is subjective, but remember that the majority tends toward the median." Um, yeah, and so I guess going back to what the Mandela effect is for a moment, I guess first I should explain where it gets its name from. I mentioned this when we were watching that interview the last time, but it's worth reinforcing for people who this is their first time hearing about it. The Mandela effect is named after Nelson Mandela, who is, I guess, the subject of perhaps the most famous Mandela effect, or at least one of the most famous and arguably one of the most consequential Mandela effects. And that is the belief by some, or the confabulation, the misremembering, whatever. I don't know. That sounds like a spin off of like a Persona game, misremembering, but misremembering of the reality that Nelson Mandela was arrested in South Africa, um, imprisoned for decades by the apartheid government for his role as the leader of a terrorist organization um, in South Africa. And some people remember it as Nelson Mandela died in prison, when in reality, Nelson Mandela uh, got out of prison. He was released and became the president of South Africa. Now, why do people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison? I can't say specifically why that is. Probably because of some sort of like, well, first of all, Americans telling me that they are, wrong about a historical detail of another